dear Enrico Letta, distinguished guests and speakers, dear students, dear friends. It is my very special duty and pleasure to wish you all a warm, albeit virtual, welcome to Sciences Po. I would like to thank you all for accepting our invitation to Sciences Po's Youth and Leaders Summit, a unique international conference, this year in its 6th edition, which gives students a central role in both its organization and in the debates that it renders possible. For such is the very purpose of this event. Every year, our Youth and Leaders Summit brings together some of the world's most influential decision makers and thinkers in order to engage in dialogue with those who aspire to follow in their footsteps, that is to say, our students. And after 6 years, I think it is fair to say that this event has now become something of an established tradition. Yet, this does not stop us from adjusting and improving the format of the summit. And this year's edition is brilliant proof of this, because we have adapted to the health crisis by moving from the 1 to 2 day physical format to offer a wholly online 3-day program. So that, if anything, the health crisis has been turned into an amazing opportunity, for never has the menu been quite so rich or quite so enticing. And we have endeavored to use this enhanced format in order to further our main goal, that is to say, in order to give our students even more space in the organization and the way this event is going to unfold. Obviously, we know that this dialogue between contemporary leaders and those who will soon be working with them and later taking over from them is extremely valuable for our students. It's an opportunity for them to take effective ownership of the issues which they study in the classroom and to engage with those who have direct experience of dealing with these issues in what we might dub the real world. But I'm also convinced that these exchanges have a great deal to offer to the leaders whom we invite. Because here, in discussing and being challenged by young people from around the world, they get to encounter new visions of society, new ways of thinking, and new ambitions. And I'm confident that the some 50 world-class leaders, personalities, and thinkers who agreed to be part of the summit this year accepted our invitation precisely for that reason. It is a clear testament to the interest which international decision makers show in Sciences Po, in our School of International Affairs, but most importantly, as I said, in our students. Of course, traditions are not the result of spontaneous generation, and so I would like to thank those who have helped establish this tradition year after year, most particularly the New York Times for supporting us with this event for the 4th year running. And I would like to thank very warmly as well the sponsors who enabled us to organize this event this year, that is to say, Microsoft. This 2021 Youth and Leaders Summit will concentrate on an extremely wide and, of course, extremely complex topic: wars and peace, solving conflicts, and building human security. The end of the Cold War era was greeted with much hope, as we recall. It was expected that a new world order with peace, justice, economic and social development, and more equality would slowly take root. What we see now is that a century of multilateralism is in fact under attack, with the resurgence of nationalistic governments in various countries in the world, with the failure of global and regional multilateral institutions to deliver lasting peace, to prevent irreparable damage from being done to the environment, and to promote economic prosperity for all. What we're left with is, in effect, for all practical purposes, a multipolar and fragmented world disorder. Of course, this instability allows both for the rise of regional powers and transnational actors who contest the West world order, but also for new voices to be heard in the form of civil and social movements across the globe. So how do we define wars and peace in the 21st century? Can peace exist without social justice? What types of war are we facing when more than 100 conflicts are taking place across the globe? What are the opportunities and challenges offered by artificial intelligence, by technological change to face these crises? Of course, I will not be reckless enough to try and answer those questions myself, especially in front of so many experts. But those questions will form some of the underlying themes of this 6th edition of the Youth and Leaders Summit, and I'm sure that we're all very keen to witness the debates to which they're likely to give rise. I would like to thank all the speakers for agreeing to take part in the summit, for sharing their thinking with us, and most importantly, for their willingness to be challenged by our students. And of course, I'd like to thank with especial warmth all the staff and students of our Paris School of International Affairs for having thrown so much talent, so much passion into organizing this event. And if you'll allow me, I'd like to add one last word. Although we're in a bright mood today, as is only natural in anticipation of great discussions and great debates, I find it necessary to remind us all of the terrible situation which is faced by one of us, one of our colleagues, Fariba Adelha, who's a researcher at Sciences Po in our Center for International Studies. Fariba, as some of you probably know, is currently detained in Iran for no other reason than trying to do her job. As we start this summit, Fariba has been deprived of her freedom for close to 600 days. And dedicating this event to her is, for me, a way of stressing that she's constantly present in our minds and in our hearts, and that we can know no respite until she regains her freedom. Without further ado, let me hand over to the extraordinary Dean of PSIA, President Enrico Letta. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, dear Frédéric Mion, Directeur de Sciences Po. Thank you very much all for this great event that we are now about to start. I'm really very happy because we are at the 6th edition of this idea that we started 5 years ago, January 16, when we started debating on the role of the UN at that time, the role of the successor of Ban Ki-moon. We discussed on the future of multilateralism. And we are today in a discussion on wars and peace that is similar for some aspects. The world has changed very much. The new situation in the US, what is happening in Asia, new conflicts around the world, a new complicated, hopeful situation in Europe too. Many topics where the old discussion around wars and peace seems to be today full of meanings. This is why, under the leadership of Lakhdar Brahimi, I would like to thank Lakhdar very much because his leadership of the organizing committee of the Youth and Leaders Summit is always wise and full of ideas. We are able this year to have this event, of course online, but through the online procedures, we are able to have more speakers, as Frédéric Mion just said, to have more panels, and to have more opportunities for interaction with students, because the speakers accepted to give the students and all of us the privilege to have breakout sessions where they can discuss and interact with very small group of students. So the interaction is possible and can be really very, very useful. Maybe better, I don't know, rather than the physical interaction, we will see next year, and we will see what will be the activity of and our mission in terms of education after the pandemic. We will try to combine the best of the two worlds. I have to say that this event that we are beginning now will last for 3 days. that is unique. In the past, we had just one entire day of working activities. And I'm sure that this change will be very useful to have more people connected. Of course, we are in 3 days because we can work only in hours that are allowing all the people connected from the US and from Asia to be present. Our students are today physically in the US or in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, and the rest of Europe. So time zone oblige us to work in 3 days. And today, the first day, will be a fantastic kickoff with the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, and in the afternoon with other 2 guest speakers, keynote speakers, the High Representative and Vice President of the European Commission in charge for Foreign and Security Policy, Josep Borrell, and la ministre française des Armées, Madame Florence Parly, que nous remercierons cet après-midi à 5 heures de tout notre cœur pour la clôture qu'elle fera de notre journée. So I think the possibility and the opportunity for our students to interact, to pose questions, to interact with the leaders and the speakers will be really unique. So without further ado, I stop here immediately. I give the floor to our first keynote speaker, Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO, former Prime Minister of Norway, a well-known expert and a fantastic partner with our students for many opportunities to understand better the situation. I would like to end up also thanking the entire Sciences Po through the director, Frédéric Mion, who is with us this morning, for the support that Sciences Po as a whole gave always to this idea of the Youth and the Summit, and the support in this 6th edition as well. I would like also to thank the New York Times, as Frédéric just did, because it is the 4th edition with this fantastic partnership with the New York Times. Thank you so much. And of course, our sponsor this year, Microsoft. I stop here. Dear Jens, dear Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, I give you the floor for your introductory remarks. Then the interaction with students will follow. We are on YouTube now, so I'm very pleased to say hello to all those who are not students, who are not professors of our community, but who are interested in what will happen. Of course, students will have the opportunity to interact with their questions, and then the rest of the day will follow. Thank you so much. Jens, dear Secretary General, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon to you all in Paris or wherever you find yourselves in these Corona times. And thank you, Dean Letta, dear Enrico, for inviting me to speak at the International Sciences Po Youth and Leaders Summit. It is actually a special pleasure to address one of France's top educational institutions, because France is a key NATO ally, a founding member of our alliance, and for over 70 years, it has played a crucial role in safeguarding peace. When I look back to my own years as a student at the University of Oslo, the world was a very different place. In 1987, I wrote my thesis on macroeconomic planning under uncertainty, on how to manage fluctuating oil revenues. Little did I know then about what uncertainty would look like today. It was the time of the Cold War, the time when NATO had to focus on a single adversary, the Soviet Union, and when the line between war and peace was clearer. Today, this is a more blurred line. we need to deal with multiple threats coming from state and non-state actors and from multiple directions, on land, at sea, in the air, in space and in cyberspace. Our adversaries challenge us using bombs and aircraft, but also bots and algorithms. In this more unpredictable world, we face a more assertive Russia, brutal terrorist groups like ISIS, more sophisticated cyber attacks, intensifying geopolitical competition with the rise of China, potentially dangerous new technologies, disruption due to climate change, and deadly viruses. For NATO, this means we need to be prepared for any threat and any challenge at any time. And this is actually what we are doing. Let me give you some examples. After years of cutting defense spending, all allies are investing more in defense. For the first time, we have deployed combat-ready forces to the east of our alliance in response to Russia's aggressive actions. We are working together to deal with the security impact of the rise of China and new technologies. And we have designated cyberspace and space as operational domains. And our militaries are supporting civilian efforts to counter the coronavirus. So NATO is doing more, but the world is moving faster than ever before. So we need to adapt even faster. That is why NATO leaders asked me to conduct a reflection on the future of the alliance. It is why I launched the NATO 2030 initiative, and why engaging with tomorrow's leaders like you is so valuable. Because you were born into this unpredictable world. You have the greatest stake in our security, and you must have your say in the future of NATO. So I have appointed a group of emerging young leaders from across the alliance to advise me on NATO 2030. They will share their ideas with me in early February. At the same time, NATO will host 10 prestigious universities, including Sciences Po, to compete in NATO's first ever policy hackathon, to develop disruptive ideas on NATO's future. My conversation with you today is part of my broader engagement with young people, civil society, and the private sector. It will help me formulate my recommendations on NATO 2030, which I will present at the next NATO summit in Brussels later this year. NATO 2030 has 3 priorities: to keep our alliance militarily strong, make it politically stronger, and ensure it takes a more global approach. Let me take each of these in turn. So first, for a strong military alliance, we have to invest, to have the right forces with the right equipment, and we have to keep our technological edge, to remain competitive in a more competitive world. But to have strong militaries, we also need strong societies. That is why boosting resilience is a key task for NATO. We need more robust infrastructure, power grids, telecommunications, including 5G, ports, airports, roads, and railways. And we need safer and more diverse supply lines. For example, for fuel, food, and, as we have seen recently, for medical equipment. Resilience is a collective effort, and it requires continued cooperation with partners like the European Union. Together, we must do more to identify and address gaps in our resilience. This means we need to take into account the risks related to foreign investments and foreign control of our critical assets, infrastructure, and technologies. Decisions on investments and ownership are not just financial or economic. We should not let short-term economic gains undermine long-term security interests. The second priority of NATO 2030 is to strengthen NATO as a political alliance. NATO is the only place where Europe and North America come together every single day. It is a unique political platform. We should use this more to discuss issues that affect our security, such as the consequences of climate change, and to coordinate the use of our military, economic, and political tools more effectively. This unique platform is also the best venue to address our differences. Because 30 allies don't always agree on everything. But when we disagree, we discuss and look for ways to solve our differences together. That is what we have always done. And that is what we are doing today. For example, to deal with tensions in the Eastern Mediterranean. NATO provides the platform for Greece and Turkey to come together. We have developed a mechanism between the two allies to help prevent dangerous incidents and accidents, and to pave the way for diplomatic discussions to settle the underlying disputes. The third priority for NATO 2030 is to ensure our alliance takes a more global approach. NATO should remain a regional organization for Europe and North America. But the challenges we face are global, from terrorism to nuclear proliferation, pandemics to disinformation campaigns, and of course, the return of great power competition with the rise of China. China is not an adversary, and its rise presents opportunities for our economies and our trade. But there are also serious challenges. China has the world's second largest defense budget. It continues to invest massively in military modernization. And China does not share our values. It does not respect human rights. It bullies other countries and tries to undermine the international rules-based order. Neither America nor Europe can deal with such challenges on their own. That is why I don't believe in America alone, just as I don't believe in Europe alone. I believe in America and Europe together. Because together in NATO we represent half of the world's economic might and half of the world's military might. So we must adopt a more global approach and build a community of democracies, together with existing partners like Australia, Japan, New Zealand and South Korea, and possibly new ones like Brazil and India. We must step up to defend our values and protect our way of life. Dear students, I started by telling you about my university thesis on the uncertainty created by fluctuating oil prices. The message of my thesis was that we cannot get rid of uncertainty, but we can find a way to manage uncertainty. Today, this same message is true when it comes to our security. We do not know what the next crisis will be, so we have to be prepared for the unforeseen. Therefore, we need a strategy to deal with uncertainty. We have one. That strategy is NATO. All for one, one for all. So that regardless of what happens, we can keep our nation safe and free. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, dear Secretary General, dear Jens, for your introductory remarks. for having focused on NATO 2030 as a key point of our discussion. Thank you for sharing with us some of the ideas around this perspective. We have some questions. I start by reading the questions, and I would like, of course, to ask you to answer these questions. First one is from Ana Lucia. The question is about, I think we will pose this question, the same question this afternoon to your good friend Josep Borrell to listen also his answer. And the question from Ana Lucia is, what is NATO's view in regards to the prospect of a stronger European security union? We know very well that the debate in Europe about strategic autonomy is a debate that is a crossing debate with the future of NATO and NATO 2030 discussion. So I think maybe it is the best way to start our interaction, and the question from Ana Lucia is the perfect kickoff. I give you the floor.
I strongly welcome efforts by the European Union to strengthen its work when it comes to defense. That has actually been something that NATO has called for many, many years. Because if more EU efforts on defense means increased defense investments, then of course that's something we welcome. And I believe that more efforts by EU on defense will require more investments. And that's absolutely in line with what NATO has been asking for many, many years, and we will welcome that. The same increased EU efforts on defense will help to develop new capabilities, also available for NATO allies, also something we have been calling for many, many times. And we welcome those efforts by the European Union. And I also think that EU efforts on defense will be important for another reason, and that is that it will hopefully be a way, at least that's a stated goal of these efforts, to address the fragmentation of the European defense industry. That's politically very sensitive, but it is important. Just to give you one example, in the United States, they have many, many battle tanks, and they have only one type of main battle tanks. So the cost of maintenance, development, training, spare parts goes down because you have the economy of scale, many tanks, same type, low cost per unit. In Europe, there are much fewer battle tanks, and there are 9 different. So the cost of maintenance, training, spare parts, all that increases. The unit cost goes up. So this fragmentation, the lack of ability to develop one system, adds very much to the cost of providing defense in Europe. And battle tanks is only one example. My good friend Josep Borrell have a long list, and he uses this example many, many times, of many other capabilities, ships, planes, drones, all over. You have the same problem of lack of economy of scale because of the fragmentation of the European defense industry. So not only do they spend too little, but what they get out of that is also much too little because the cost is so high because of the fragmentation. So I believe that EU efforts on defense, and that's the stated goal, will address these challenges. Too few capabilities, too much fragmentation, too little spending. So in that sense, and in that way, EU efforts on defense is something I really, really welcome, support, and I've actually called for many years. But we have to also know and recognize that EU efforts on defense cannot replace NATO, should not compete with NATO, can never be an alternative to NATO. Partly because less than 50% of the people living in NATO live in an EU country. Less than 50% of GDP in NATO comes from an EU country. And we need to, of course, mobilize 100% of our resources and protect 100% of the people. And only 20% of NATO's defense expenditure come from EU members, from NATO EU members. So EU efforts cannot replace, EU cannot defend Europe. NATO is for the NATO members in Europe the bedrock for our security. This is partly about money. 20% of defense expenditure come from EU allies. It's also partly about geography. Norway in the north, Turkey in the south, and in the west, of course, the United States, Canada, but also United Kingdom are critical for European security, for the defense of Europe. And then lastly, this is also about politics, because any attempt to divide Europe from North America to increase the distance to go alone will not only weaken NATO, but it will divide Europe. So I don't believe in America alone. I don't believe in Europe alone. I believe in North America and Europe together. And as long as we stand together, we are able to deal with any threats and any challenges. Alone, we are weaker. Together, we are stronger.
Thank you. There are other questions on the same topic, so I would like to put them together. Miruna, Luis, and Joanna. The questions are, first of all, on the topic of burden sharing. You just mentioned this topic. What are, in your views, the steps to have a more concrete burden sharing? Which timing? Another point is about, is there the possibility to have a cooperation with different missions? What domains for the European Union and which ones for NATO, for instance? And the other one is about the structural changes. Do you see the need of structural institutional reforms at NATO level in the relationship with the European Union and in the way to organize a more effective institutional framework for the cooperation between the European Union and NATO?
I think it's always important to have an open mind and also look into structural issues. And actually, over the last years, we have been able to lift the NATO-EU cooperation to unprecedented levels. I signed with the former presidents of the European Union, President Donald Tusk and President Jean-Claude Juncker, back in 2016 and then later on in 2018, I think it was, two joint declarations outlining 74 different areas where Europe, EU and NATO can work more together. And we are now stepping up when it comes to cyber, maritime exercises, and in many other areas we are working more closely together, Europe or EU and NATO, than we have ever done before. And that's not strange, because more than 90% of the people living in EU live in a NATO country. So of course it makes, and we share the same neighborhood, we share many of the same threats and challenges. Of course it makes a lot of sense that we work together, despite the fact that we are two different organizations, and of course also covering some different responsibilities. So yes, we should always look into how we can further strengthen, how we can further develop our cooperation partnership. And I'm proud, and I know that this is also something both High Representative Vice President Josep Borrell, who will speak later on to you, but also President Ursula von der Leyen, President Charles Michel, they also support this idea of strengthening further the cooperation between NATO and the European Union. Part of that can also, of course, be a structural discussion. I'm just afraid to make structure the most important thing. We have structures, we have institutions. So what we need is political will and the strength to implement actions. So I'm not against structural changes. I'm only a bit afraid of making the structures the main issue instead of the content, what we actually do together, the main issue. And that has been the focus of the leadership in EU and me myself. I recently, for instance, as the first Secretary General of NATO ever met with a whole college of EU commissioners. President von der Leyen invited me, and that was a great honor to meet them all, discuss, and of course what NATO does matters for EU in many ways, and vice versa, on military mobility, transportation, resilience, telecommunications, all that is important for EU, but also important for NATO, and of course it matters that we coordinate as much as possible. Burden sharing was one of the issues. The burden sharing is important, and I think we have to understand that different US presidents have stated again and again that it is unfair that 70% of NATO's defense expenditure comes from the United States. And as I said, 20% from EU, NATO allies, and then the rest from countries like United Kingdom, Turkey, Canada, Norway, and so on, non-EU European countries and Canada. While 50% of NATO's GDP comes from non-US allies. It was actually President Obama that was very strong on this back at the NATO summit in 2014, where all NATO allies agreed that we should spend more. The good news is that we have follow-up on the commitment we made in 2014. So now all NATO allies have invested more and have added extra. And that has, we still have a long way to go, but more allies now meet the 2% guideline than ever before, up from 3 in 2014 to 10 now. So that's a huge difference. And the timeline, which was also part of the question, is that we decided in 2014 to move towards spending 2% of GDP on defense within a decade, meaning 2024. So burden sharing is important. The good news is that we are making progress, and that's also part of the adaptation, the re-energized strength of NATO. Let me add one more thing, and then I promise to stop, is that, of course, the incoming administration offers a unique opportunity to revitalize, to re-energize the cooperation North America, Europe in NATO, and I look forward to working with the next president, President Biden, on especially these issues.
Thank you. We have many questions on the US, on President Biden. I will leave this question maybe for a second part of our discussion, because there was an interesting question on Russia, and I would like to ask you, NATO constantly expanded to countries from the former Soviet sphere of influence, asks Renaud. What do you respond to those who consider that is a fuel to Russian nationalism? So the relationship with Russia and the relationship with countries that were part of USSR. And if I may add a question, the question is about also the frozen conflicts on the borders of Russia. You mentioned your thesis. I have to mention my PhD thesis. In this period, we were during the Nagorno-Karabakh explosion of the conflict. And Nagorno-Karabakh is since then, and it is still one of these conflicts. In the last months, not only frozen, but also very hot conflict. What do you think about all these frozen conflicts? Because we had in these years, in South Ossetia or in Donbass, more and more part of these former USSR regions that are today in this very difficult situation. Do you see any possibilities to overcome these complicated issues? Do you see a role for NATO? Do you see other exit strategies? the topic is a very hot one.
Yes, absolutely. First, on this issue about NATO enlargement and whether that has fueled Russian nationalism, as if, in a way, and I've heard that question phrased in different ways many times, as if, in a way, the enlargement of NATO has been some kind of aggressive action against Russia, has justified Russia's use of force against other countries, like you mentioned, Donbass and Georgia and so on, and as if the enlargement of NATO is a kind of unacceptable, assertive behavior of NATO. I think we have to start with the basics. The basics is that all countries in Europe have signed the Helsinki Final Act and also many other documents which clearly states that all nations have the sovereign right of choosing their own path. And to be honest, for me, you don't need the Helsinki Final Act to agree with that. It's so obvious that sovereign nations should have and must have the right to decide their own path, including what kind of security arrangements they want to be part of or not want to be part of. So it's the whole idea that, in a way, NATO has been very assertive or aggressive by moving eastwards, by enlarging with countries that were formerly part of the Warsaw Pact, Poland, Hungary, at that time Czechia and the Republic, and Slovakia, and many other countries in Eastern and Central Europe, and including some former countries which used to be republics or part of the Soviet Union, the Baltic countries. You have to understand that that's sovereign decisions by them. It's not NATO forcing its way eastwards. It's these countries that, through democratic processes, decide that they want to be members of NATO. And then NATO's door is open. We will never force a country to join. So when a good friend and neighbor, Finland or Sweden, have for decades decided they don't want to be members of NATO, we totally respect that. But when countries like Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, and many others, Romania, decide that they want to be members, of course, if they meet the NATO standards, they should be allowed to be members. And the most important thing is that whether these countries are going to be members of NATO or not is for NATO and the country to decide. Russia has no right to try to intervene or to block or to stop the membership of a sovereign nation into NATO. And sometimes I use my own country as an example. Because the idea is that since Moscow don't like or dislike that Lithuania joined NATO, they should never have been allowed to join. Well, if you apply the same thinking on my own country, Norway, we joined in 1949. Norway is a neighbor of Russia. Russia didn't, or the Soviet Union at that time didn't like that Norway joined. Stalin actually expressed clearly that he wants Norway to stay out of NATO. But luckily, the leadership in NATO at that time, in Paris, in London, in Washington and elsewhere, they said, no, Norway, a neighbor of Russia, has the sovereign right to decide its own path. They want to become member. They meet the NATO standards, so we welcome them. And that's exactly the same we have said to other independent countries, for instance, the Baltic countries, when they wanted to join some years ago. So for me, it's almost a provocation, just in a way question the right of sovereign nations to decide their own future. That's in a way to accept sphere of influences. It's to accept that big nations have a kind of say over neighbors. I don't want to live in that kind of world because I'm coming from a small country neighboring a big country. And if we accept that big countries can decide what small neighbors can do or not do, then we're back to the old times where the big powers decided over the small countries. We don't want that kind of world. We want a world built on rules, on respect for nations, regardless of the size of the armed forces or their economies or whatever. So this is about fundamental principles, and if we start to compromise on that, we are on a very dangerous path towards a place we should not end. And that's my also answer to when it comes to for instance, also that's a kind of bridge to some of the issues you raised about the frozen conflicts. Georgia wants to become a member of NATO. And that's not for Russia to stop. Whether Georgia becomes a member of NATO or not is for Georgia and NATO allies to decide, and only them. Because anything else would be to infringe the sovereign rights of sovereign independent countries. And then, of course, you can have different arguments, but it's not for Russia to decide what Georgia has to do. It's for Georgia and NATO allies. And therefore, what they have done in Abkhazia, in South Ossetia, violating the territorial integrity, the sovereignty of Georgia, an independent country, is unacceptable. The same with Ukraine, of course, illegal annexation of Crimea, destabilizing Donbas, eastern Ukraine. It's violating absolute fundamental principles in the way we should create a peaceful, stable world. NATO's role is to provide support to these countries, capacity building, help with reforms, NATO allies provide training, we have presence in different ways in both Georgia and Ukraine, but of course we need to find political solutions, different conflicts, Moldova, Nagorno-Karabakh you mentioned, different conflicts, but the main message is that we should respect the sovereignty, and of course we should also look for political solutions, and NATO supports the different efforts to find political negotiated solutions to the different conflicts, more or less frozen.
There are two questions on the US and on the new president and the new US administration. Two students, Anat and Martha. The first question is exactly about the fact that Trump was not a great friend of multilateralism. We know very well this point. But we have to say that maybe NATO was the only multilateral forum where he was a little bit more involved. And he was not only involved, but he was asking a bigger involvement, engagement, as you said, from the different allies and from the European allies. So how do you foresee the change and the role of the new administration, President Biden's administration? What do you expect? And the second point is related, that's another interesting question, Martha, saying that given that the threat to stability in the US is increasingly internal, how would increased defense investment effectively address this threat and its causes? So do you see a deal or a contradiction in the US between the need for more internal defense investment and the need for the US to be present at world level? What do you think about these two very large and very complicated issues?
First of all, I have to clearly state that it's not for me to speak on behalf of an incoming new administration in the United States of America, a NATO ally. What I can say is that I look forward to working with President Joe Biden when he assumes office in a few days this week, and also with the incoming new Vice President, Kamala Harris. I spoke with Joe Biden also after the elections, and I know him as a very strong supporter of NATO, of multilateral institutions, of multilateral cooperation, and he knows NATO very well because he has served as vice president, and I had the honor of working with him in that capacity. And also in my previous position as Prime Minister of Norway, I also had a privilege of working with then both Vice President Joe Biden, but also in his capacity as chairman of the Senate's Foreign Relations Committee. So he knows Europe, he knows NATO. He has publicly, over many, many years, been a strong supporter of the transatlantic bond, and I'm absolutely confident that when he assumes office, that will provide a platform to re-energize, to revitalize the transatlantic bond. Of course, that doesn't mean that there will be zero challenges and no problems, but the value of sitting around the same table is recognized, and I think we have to understand that NATO is unique because it's the only institution where North America and Europe meet every day. We have, of course, many ministerial meetings, we have summits, but we have this day-to-day presence in the NATO headquarters with the political cooperation, the political staff, the ambassadors. We have the command structures, the NATO bases, the NATO missions and operations in Afghanistan, in Europe, in many other places, bringing together North America and Europe on a daily basis on all levels, bringing us together. And that in itself creates a partnership, a friendship, a trust, which is of great importance for the transatlantic bond, the key, the bedrock of the transatlantic bond. And I'm absolutely confident that he and his administration will build on that. Then burden sharing. Also, burden sharing is part of that because we have to realize that there is a very strong bipartisan support for NATO in the United States. Democrats and Republicans, and when you look at the opinion polls, actually now there is record high support for NATO in the United States. And I'm absolutely confident that one of the reasons we see this is that they see that European allies and Canada are stepping up when it comes to burden sharing. We still have a long way to go, but we have taken it seriously, not only to please the United States, but because we see that we live in a more unpredictable, more dangerous world, with everything from ISIS, changing global balance of power, cyber threats, so we need to invest more in our security. And that is recognized in the United States, and I'm absolutely certain that also the incoming Biden administration would, of course, be focused on burden sharing. You have to remember that Joe Biden, he was vice president when President Obama made this an important issue at the NATO summit in 2014, when we made the decision to start to increase defense spending, and European allies have delivered. Then, also, I think that, of course, there are many domestic challenges in all NATO allied countries, and over the last weeks we have seen clearly exposed some of those challenges in our biggest ally, the United States. But I think it's absolutely possible for the United States, as it is for other allies, to both address domestic challenges, unrest, whatever it is, and at the same time see the value of protecting ourselves against external threats and challenges. And actually, if anything, I think that the more we're able to prove to the United States that NATO is relevant for them, and we are striving for fair burden sharing, the more support and the stronger support we will have from across the United States to our alliance. So I don't accept in a way the contradiction between either being focused on domestic challenges, which of course is important for all allies, also the United States, and or being focused on external threats and challenges, which is the main responsibility of NATO. If anything, I think that the more successful we are in showing that NATO delivers, NATO, we stand together, we help each other, it also helps the United States to address some of the challenges they see domestically. Let me just add one thing, and that is that the rise of China, the change in the global balance of power, makes NATO even more important for the United States. China will soon have the largest economy in the world. They already have the second largest defense budget. They are leading in some technologies which are also important for defense. We know disruptive technologies as artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, facial recognition. All of this is also important when it comes to future defense systems. And therefore, the United States need friends. And in NATO, they have 29 friends and allies. And if they are concerned about the size of China, then it's even more important to keep friends and allies close, because together we are 50% of GDP, 50% of the world's military might.
Thank you. There are two questions on the Mediterranean, on Turkey and the Mediterranean. One from Aurélie, and the other one is from Denise. Aurélie, on Turkey, I think you are expecting a question on Turkey. Turkey is incontournable in this present situation. So, what are your explanations on what will be the future of relationship within NATO allies? Turkey is facing a period in which relationship with the European Union, relationship with the US are very tense. How do you see the situation there? How do you feel the future? And Aurélie asks you also, how will your personal diplomatic relationship with Erdogan are? And so this is on Turkey, and the other one on the Mediterranean, I think it's related. Is there the possibility to have a more focus from NATO on the southern flank? And would such a commitment dilute the alliance's attention to the eastern flank? In a few words, is there a contradiction in being involved in the south, in the Mediterranean, and in the rest of the scenarios?
Let me start with the last part of that question. Again, NATO has to be ready, and NATO is ready and capable of dealing with threats from whatever direction. We cannot focus on one direction. We need to be prepared for threats, challenges from the east, from the south, from the west, from the north, and also from cyberspace. And therefore, we cannot accept, and we should never end in a situation where we have to choose between either focusing in that direction or the other direction. Because there will be surprises, and we cannot tell from where the next crisis will happen. Just to illustrate, you know, I guess there were a lot of analysis and assessments and intelligence in the 90s about what was the most risky, what was the most likely attack against NATO. I think hardly anyone imagined that the biggest attack on NATO was going to happen in the United States against the Twin Towers and Pentagon and the United States. So actually that happened in the West, organized from Afghanistan in the Far East, or at least East. So I'm just saying this because this idea that we have to be, because we cannot foresee the future, therefore we have to be prepared for the unforeseen in all directions. And that mind has to be there, because if not, we will be too narrow-minded and we will not be able to respond in a proper way. Second, it's a bit artificial. Also, I agree that something is north and something is south and west and east. I agree that that's geographical directions. But from a security perspective, it's a bit artificial to put that into these categories. Because when we speak about the east, we often think about Russia. And we see a more assertive Russia in the east. But we see them also in the south. We see much more Russian presence now in North Africa, in Libya, in other parts of North Africa, in the Middle East, in Syria. We see them in the north, in the Arctic, in the Polar Sea, in the Barents Sea, with new military bases, with more naval presence, new submarines. And these submarines, they can travel around. So if we are concerned about Russia, then Russia is also in the north, in the south, and also sometimes in the west. So my message is that NATO has to be able to address challenges from all directions at the same time, and they actually merge, they go together, because, for instance, cyberspace is all over. Then on Turkey, there is no way to hide, and I have never tried to do so, that there are disagreements and differences within NATO. And the allies have expressed their concerns about different issues, like, for instance, the Turkish decision to acquire the Russian air defense system S-400, or the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean, and other issues. I have raised those concerns myself, and I had many discussions in Ankara about these issues, and expressed my concerns, for instance, about the consequences of the Turkish decision to acquire S-400. But at the same time, I believe that our task is to look for ways forward to address these concerns, and to make sure that NATO is the platform we actually are, providing a meeting place for allies to sit down, discuss, have open, frank discussions when there are disagreements, to try to find ways forward, positive approaches. And that's exactly what we have done when it comes to the Eastern Mediterranean, North Africa, Libya, or other issues. And we have been able to make some progress. For instance, establishing the deconfliction mechanism between two NATO allies, Greece and Turkey, is important. Because we have seen before, we actually saw in the 1990s that similar tensions between Turkey and Greece in the same area in the Mediterranean and also in the Aegean Sea actually led to casualties, to downing of planes, helicopters, and fatalities. We need to avoid these kind of incidents, accidents now, as we have seen before, because they are dangerous, they can lead to the loss of lives, and they can spiral out of control. And that's exactly why we have established this mechanism at NATO with a hotline between the two countries. They meet, we have technical military communications. They have agreed to cancel some military exercises in the Eastern Mediterranean. All of this, and we are looking into how we can expand this mechanism. All of this to reduce risks for incidents and accidents. We have seen some already, but we need to prevent them from happening again, and become more serious. And we also believe that the NATO efforts on military deconfliction is a way to pave the way and help to support political negotiations on the real underlying issues, disagreements between Greece and Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean. And we have seen also some positive step in that direction, the resumption of talks between Greece and Turkey. So I'm not saying this is easy, but I'm saying that NATO's role is to bring allies together and look for ways to find solutions. Also because I think we have to understand that yes, there are concerns and disagreements, but at the same time, Turkey is an important ally. They have the second biggest army in NATO. We can just look at the map. Geography matters. They have a strategic location. The only NATO ally bordering Iraq and Syria, have helped us in the fight against terrorism, helped to liberate the territories controlled by ISIS in Iraq and Syria. NATO uses infrastructure in Turkey to support that fight. We have the AWACS surveillance planes flying out of Konya, a Turkish base, helping the coalition to defeat Daesh, ISIS. And no NATO ally hosts more refugees than Turkey, and no NATO ally have suffered more terrorist attacks. So we need to stand together. Yes, there are differences, but then NATO provides the best platform to sit down and address those differences.
There are some questions on climate change. And of course, it will be one of the topics that in this Youth Leader Summit will be focused, or there will be one entire panel on this topic. So would be very interesting for us to have your take on that. So Stanislas, Arnaud, Joan, different questions, but the questions are all focused on is there a role for NATO in facing issues as climate change? Is there a strategy in NATO 2030 on these topics? What role can NATO play in cross-border environmental challenges? What is your reaction on these questions?
Climate change is extremely important, and climate change is important for many reasons, also because it affects our security. Rising sea levels, warm weather, more extreme weather, more flooding, more wildfires will directly affect the livelihood of people all over the world. But it will also be a conflict multiplier, force people to move, increase competition about scarce resources, water, land, and so on. So in that sense, climate change is also a security issue. And therefore, NATO has to address climate change. And NATO 2030 is also about how can NATO adopt, how can NATO respond, how can NATO in a better way deal with the security consequences of climate change. Of course, NATO is not going to, in a way, be the main platform for negotiate climate agreements like the Paris Accord. That's for the UN, that's for those institutions to do. And I think we all should support those efforts, not try to establish competing structures. But NATO's responsibility is to address the security consequences of climate change. And that's partly just by analyzing, understanding, demonstrating the security consequences, because that will add to the urgency. That will make it easier for those who are negotiating climate agreements and working for mitigation efforts, measures to reduce emissions. I think they will give them one extra argument. I think they already have more than enough arguments. But if they need an extra argument in combating climate change, reducing emissions of greenhouse gases or global warming gases, then security is yet another argument for doing what they are already doing. So I think by providing facts, by being transparent, by analyzing the problem, the security consequences of climate change, we are helping all those in different countries, in the UN system, in the Climate Convention, to address these issues, and that's one role of NATO. We also need to understand the problem, because we need, when we do our assessments of threats, of challenges, and adopt our posture and prepare, then we need to understand the consequences of climate change for our military forces and the conflicts we may be faced with in the future. And this is everything from, for instance, the challenges you see emanating from the south, the instability, migration, refugees, but also very practical issues. Rising sea levels will affect our naval bases. We already see that many places in the world. Soldiers are operating out there in extreme weather or already in the high north or in the deserts and the jungles. And of course, equipment dealing with, for instance, extreme heat. We have a mission in Iraq. They have suffered, they have seen the consequences of extreme heat in Baghdad in Iraq. So whatever we do will also have to take into account more wilder, wetter, extreme weather in different ways, and that will affect the development of capabilities, equipment for our personnel. And thirdly, NATO could also do its part to try to help reduce emissions. And therefore, I welcome that we have different programs in NATO trying to reduce, for instance, the dependence on fossil fuels, Dutch soldiers increasingly use solar panels instead of diesel generators during operations. The United States and Canada are looking at integrating solar panels into their soldiers' combat gear to power their electronic equipment. And other NATO countries are experimenting with hydrogen fuel cells and batteries to generate and store electricity. I use these examples to illustrate that whatever we can do to try to increase energy efficiency of our battleships or our battle tanks or our operations and missions in general will be good for the environment. It will reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, but it will also reduce the vulnerability of our forces. Because you know from many operations, for instance in Afghanistan, that just the transportation of fossil fuel, of diesel, is actually a very huge, challenging task. And there is a need for a lot of fossil fuels, diesel, to generate, for instance, electricity at the different camps we have. So if we are able to switch to other more environmentally renewable, friendly sources of energy, we help to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, CO2, global warming gases, but we also make our forces less vulnerable and more resilient. So that's a double reason to do exactly that. And we are looking into it. We are working on it. We are stepping up, and NATO 2030 is very much about that.
We are approaching the end of our time, our conversation, but of course there's full of questions on China. So I ask you to take the questions together and to try to give a global answer. Robert, what will be the key steps for NATO to build a successful relationship with China? Luis, how can allies work together within NATO to address the rise and political assertiveness of China? Marlene, what is NATO's role in the South China Sea and East China Sea disputes? And Stanislas, a more general question, do you see a risk that NATO 2030 could further antagonize China? So it will be one of the most interesting topics. I have to say that, and I take the opportunity also to announce to our students that March the 3rd, we will dedicate our usual Wednesday to focus on the G20. Because G20 this year will be probably the unique opportunity for Chinese leadership, US new leadership, and European leadership to be together. And so we will have the Italian Sherpa, the president of G20 this year, addressing students, and it will be, I think, interesting. I say that because, of course, the relationship between China, US, and Europe are probably one of the most interesting focus in this period of Biden taking the lead of the US. So many questions. What are your answers?
My answer is that China is not an adversary for NATO or to NATO. And actually the rise of China provides a lot of opportunities for all of us, for our economies, for our trade. And we also have to understand that the rise of China has already fueled a lot of economic growth in Europe, in the United States, and all over the world. And of course, the rise of China has also been very important when it comes to alleviating poverty, because the fact that hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty has been extremely, also the rise of China has been extremely instrumental in doing exactly that. So I will first recognize the positive effects, the opportunities of the rise of China. But at the same time, we have to realize that there are some serious challenges. China is a great power that doesn't share our values. For several centuries, the biggest and strongest power in the world has been a country which has been sharing our values. Democracy, individual liberty, the rule of law. For some centuries it was the United Kingdom, then later on the United States of America. But now, soon, the biggest economy in the world will be China. In purchasing power terms, it has already surpassed the United States. Soon it will also surpass the size of the American economy in market value. So that's something new. And the new thing is that the biggest economy in the world is something we find in a country that doesn't share our values. And we see the way they behave, partly against their own population. In Hong Kong, how they treat minorities or the Uyghurs, millions of people being forced into different kinds of camps, heavy censorship, no freedom of speech, no freedom of assembly, and a brutal social control with these social points, monitoring everything that goes on the internet, giving awards to those who behave in the right way and punishing those who behave in the wrong way. This is an authoritarian system which is using advanced new technologies to monitor, to control their population in a way we have never seen before. But you also see how they behave against countries, also not only against their own population, but also against other countries in the world. Australia called for an independent investigation into the sources of COVID-19 or the coronavirus. China has punished them with sanctions or restrictions on trade and so on. Canada, they have arrested Canadian citizens because they as a kind of punishment for what Canada did in implementing the rule of law in their own country. And I know this myself because I was Prime Minister in Norway when the Norwegian Nobel Committee awarded the Peace Prize to a Chinese dissident. And they wanted Norway to regret and criticize that decision. And since we didn't do that, they punished us by blocking trade, blocking all political dialogue, blocking all meetings, trying to inflict severe damage on the Norwegian economy as a punishment. So they are bullying neighbors, bullying countries all over the world, including, for instance, Norway. And that's a behavior which we have to take very seriously. And therefore, I think we need to work even more closely with partners, like-minded democracies, as Australia, New Zealand, Korea, Japan, and we have a lot of partners all over the world, but also look into whether we can develop new partnerships with, for instance, countries like India or Brazil. China is also strong militarily. They are developing new nuclear weapons, long-range missiles, second largest defense budget, new naval capabilities, aircraft carriers, and so on. And this is something we have to take into account and they're also leading in many of the technologies which will be important for the future weapon systems, artificial intelligence, facial recognitions, and so on. So therefore we need to invest. Therefore we need to make sure that we maintain the technological edge. And that's exactly what we are doing in NATO, partly due to the shifting global balance of power. And then we also have to realize the challenges related to our infrastructure, the resilience of societies. We have a discussion about Huawei, 5G, and we have seen a convergence of minds, positions, views in NATO over just the last year. I think we have developed in NATO something we call resilience guidelines, baseline requirements for resilience, stating clearly that all allies have to make sure that they have safe and secure telecommunications, roads, airports, all the critical infrastructure. And therefore we will need to also take into account the risks related to foreign ownership. And I think we have seen a very important discussion and also development in European countries and the United States, Canada, about the risks related to vulnerabilities in, for instance, 5G networks. And that links to the question about the South China Sea and the East China Sea. NATO is not going to move into the South China Sea. Some NATO allies, of course, sail there. It's about freedom of navigation. But NATO as an alliance is not going to move into the South China Sea. But that's not the issue. The issue is that China is coming close. We are not going to move in there, but they are coming closer to us. In cyberspace, investing our infrastructure, in the Arctic, in Africa, and also with weapon systems that can reach all NATO allies. So there is no way we can deny or hide or not take into account that there are security consequences of the rise of China that NATO has to address. We will do that in a way which doesn't antagonize or establish a new adversary, but we need to understand and also address the security consequences of a fundamental shift in the balance of power, which is caused by the rise of China. That is what NATO 2030 is very much about. NATO remaining a regional alliance, but developing a stronger global approach because the threats and the challenges we face are more and more global. Thank you so much.
Thank you. There are many other questions. It is not possible to take all the questions, but I ask you in 1 minute to say maybe one word on two topics that will be at the very heart of our discussion in these very days, because we will have two panels debating on space and on cyber. So Lisa and Veronique are asking, space was declared an operational domain in 2019. What concrete steps is NATO undertaking to strengthen its collective space capabilities? Veronique, responsibilities on space-related questions are extremely widespread over NATO and member states. How can this misalignment be resolved? And on cyber, the topics that Anna and Benji are asking are related to which kind of steps do you see in the future and in NATO 2030 perspective for having at the European level and at NATO level an upgrade in the possibility to respond to cyber threats. I'm sorry because I know we are at the end, but maybe if you give us just some nuances of what you think in these final minutes.
First, on cyber, NATO has recognized the importance of cyber over the last years, and more so. Not so long time ago, we actually decided that a cyber attack can trigger Article 5, meaning that we regard a potential cyber attack as damaging, as serious as a conventional attack. So if we have a serious cyber attack, we can decide to trigger Article 5, one for all for one, as our collective defense clause. We don't have to respond in cyber, that's up to us to decide, but a cyber attack can trigger Article 5. And that demonstrates the seriousness of a potential cyber attack. Cyber attacks takes place daily. So we cannot trigger Article 5 every day, but we send the message that if needed, we trigger Article 5 as response to a cyber attack. Second, we have established cyber as operational domain, alongside land, air, and sea. And that's in a way to make sure that we have the best way to organize, to plan, to exercise our cyber defenses. And that is absolutely impossible to foresee a conflict in the future which doesn't include a cyber dimension, because it is so important for everything we do. And of course, cyber is also integrated in our other capabilities. Our new aircraft, our ships, whatever it is, they have cyber elements. They have cyber as a part of what they do, and therefore cyber is extremely important for the whole, also for all our defense capabilities. We have also created a new cyberspace operations center, and we have established a malware information sharing platform, where we're also working with the European Union to share real-time information about malware cyber attacks. We also have teams where we can deploy, help allies which are under cyber attacks. The last thing I will say is that perhaps the most important thing is that we share best practices, we help each other, and we have big exercises. Because cyber is partly about defending the NATO networks, the NATO operations, the NATO missions, but of course it's also very much about helping allies to defend their systems. And we do that by sharing information, by conducting exercises and sharing best practices, and constantly adapting and improving the way we do cyber defenses in NATO. Sorry, one more last thing, and that is that we have also started to integrate what we call national cyber effects, sometimes also referred to as offensive cyber, into our planning and our missions and operations. We have seen the importance of these kind of cyber effects in fighting Daesh, ISIS. NATO allies were instrumental in attacking the home pages, the networks, the cyber capabilities of Daesh, also in Iraq and Syria. That was of great importance because Daesh, ISIS used cyber to recruit, to spread their information, to finance and to conduct operations. So be able to penetrate these systems with offensive cyber is also part of what NATO allies do, and where NATO is working together on these issues. On space, what happens in space is important for what goes on the Earth. Communications, GPS, intelligence, surveillance, all of that is dependent on different space capabilities. And you are right that there are different allies have a lot of different capabilities. One of the purposes of establishing space as a domain and also strengthening the focus on space in NATO is not for NATO to develop space capabilities, but it is for NATO to make sure that NATO allies work more closely together, learn from each other, coordinate more their efforts, and that we can share information and support the activities we have with different space capabilities. So this is, in what I say, the first steps. We have just recently established a space center at our base in Ramstein, and then we'll go step by step, filling this framework of space as operational domain with more and more content. But it's very much about mobilizing, working together with allies, and trying to coordinate their efforts in a better way. Let me just end by saying that this has been a great honor to address this distinguished audience and to listen to your questions. I hope that at some time I can meet you in person. And in the meantime, you are more than welcome. And I'm actually looking forward to that Sciences Po will participate in the NATO hackathon, which is for the first time ever a way to try to invite students and also then from Sciences Po to take part in developing new ideas, disruptive ideas for NATO, and make sure that the younger generation have their say in the development of the future of NATO. But once again, thank you so much for inviting me. It has been a great great thing to meet you all, and Enrico, it has been great to see you. See you again, and all the best.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your generosity. You answered 26 questions, so I think it's a record in around 1 hour. So very good kickoff. Now it's time for panels, and then 4:15 Paris time we will have Josep Borrell, and 5 Paris time we will have Florence Parly. Thank you so much.
Stay safe.
Stay healthy.